For more than 60 years, Bob Dylan has written about love, loss, and the price of being human. But at 84, the man who built his legend on riddles is finally letting one truth rise above the noise. Beneath every verse, behind every half-smile and cryptic lyric, there was always one woman, the one he tried to forget, the one he never could. He's spent a lifetime keeping her story hidden, wrapped in poetry, disguised in songs that millions memorized without ever knowing who they were really about. To the world, Dylan was a prophet, a rebel, a man too private to confess what mattered most. But time has stripped away his defenses. Now, in fragments of new writing and quiet reflection, he's speaking more plainly than he ever has. The clues were always there in the heartbreak of Blood on the Tracks, the tenderness of Sara, the loneliness that followed. But the full story? That's only now becoming clear. Because after all the awards, all the myth, and all the years of silence, Bob Dylan is finally revealing the love of his life. Before the world knew his name, he was just Robert Zimmerman from Hibbing, Minnesota, a boy restless in a small mining town, already certain he was meant for something else. He spent hours alone with a radio, listening to distant voices fade in and out across the static. Country, blues, gospel, it all bled together, shaping a sound that would later change American music forever. But in those early years there was no fame, no audience, only isolation, a sense that he understood people better when he watched them from a distance. By the time he left for New York City in 1961, he had already learned how to disappear into his own thoughts. The village was alive with dreamers and poets, and Dylan, barely 20, moved through it like a ghost with a guitar. He played wherever he could, often for free, chasing the approval of an invisible future. Even then, he kept people guessing. Those who met him described a boy who spoke in riddles, who never gave a straight answer, who seemed to be writing a story only he could see. Fame arrived quickly, and it terrified him. Reporters wanted explanations for songs he barely understood himself. Fans projected meaning onto lyrics he'd written in moments of confusion and impulse, and while others basked in attention, Dylan withdrew further. Each album, each performance became a kind of armor, a way to speak without being known. He watched others, his age, fall into love easily, but he couldn't. Romance felt like exposure, another way to be interpreted, misread, consumed. Every woman he met saw the artist first, and the man second. Even as his name climbed the charts, Dylan carried the same loneliness that haunted him back in Minnesota. He was already learning that genius and isolation often walk hand in hand. When the spotlight grew too bright, he retreated to the road, moving from city to city, always avoiding what felt too permanent. Behind every song about freedom, there was the quiet fear of being tied down. Yet underneath that defiance was something softer, an unspoken longing for a connection he didn't yet believe he deserved. It would take years and countless heartbreaks set to music before Bob Dylan finally met the one woman who would make him stop running. But first, he had to face what fame had taken from him, the part of himself that still remembered what it meant to love without disguise. By the mid-60s, Bob Dylan was no longer the quiet drifter from Hibbing. He was the voice of a generation, the man who turned protest into poetry and loneliness into an anthem. Crowds filled every venue, hanging on his words as if each line could explain the world. Yet the more they adored him, the less he recognized himself. Fame didn't just elevate him, it distorted everything. How people saw him, how he saw love, even how he heard his own songs. He moved through chaos, disguised as confidence. Fans wanted revelation, critics demanded rebellion, and the young man who once sang for connection became a mystery by necessity. His interviews became performances, shrugs, deflections, strange metaphors that kept everyone guessing. The real Dylan vanished behind the legend. Those close to him said he could be warm one minute, then unreachable the next, as if the price of genius was distance. The constant touring, the pressure, the questions, he began to resent them all. He had wanted to share his voice, not surrender his life to it. Women came and went, drawn to the myth more than the man. Every relationship seemed to dissolve under the weight of expectation. Affection turned into scrutiny. Every gesture, every glance, became material for gossip columns and analysis. To protect what was left of his privacy, he built invisible walls. He wrote songs instead of explanations. "It Ain't Me Babe" wasn't just a lyric, it was a boundary. "Don't think twice, it's all right" sounded like closure. But it was really fatigue, the exhaustion of always being misunderstood. Dylan's genius gave him the power to say everything and reveal nothing. It became his defense, a mask crafted from melody and myth. Even as the world declared him untouchable, he felt trapped by that image. He longed for ordinary moments, a conversation without expectation, a smile without interpretation. But simplicity was gone. Everywhere he went, people saw a symbol, not a soul. His songs filled the airwaves, but his heart remained guarded, searching for a quiet that fame had stolen. Beneath the applause, there was still that small-town boy who once listened to the radio alone in the dark. The fame, the genius, the mask, all of it hid something fragile, and though he wouldn't admit it yet, that fragility would draw him to the one person who would see past it completely. Bob Dylan had always expressed emotion through distance. He didn't confess his feelings in conversation. He translated them into sound. His lyrics became coded messages, letters written to no one and everyone at once. In those years before the world knew who she was, his love songs carried a peculiar ache. They weren't declarations. They were goodbyes disguised as riddles. "Girl from the North Country" spoke of tenderness, but it was lined with absence. "Don't think twice, it's all right" carried the resignation of a man who wanted to stay but couldn't. And "It Ain't Me Babe" became a quiet manifesto, a way of saying that love was beautiful, but belonging to someone frightened him. These weren't songs about romance. They were about escape, and the emptiness that followed. He wrote in hotel rooms, trains, and backstage corners, scribbling lines that captured fleeting faces and fading moments. Women moved in and out of his orbit, artists, muses, believers, but each connection dissolved before it became real. To understand Dylan then was to understand a man torn between creation and closeness. He could immortalize love, but not sustain it. The moment he felt seen, he turned away, fearing it would steal his freedom. His audiences mistook this for rebellion. They called him a wanderer, a symbol of independence. But underneath there was restlessness that bordered on sorrow. Dylan was not running from love. He was running from exposure. The vulnerability that made his music timeless also made intimacy unbearable. When he sang, "You're gonna make me lonesome when you go," he wasn't performing, he was confessing. Each verse built a mythology that both revealed and concealed him. Every new album sounded like a farewell to someone the public couldn't identify. Critics analyzed the craft, but they missed the grief. Behind every metaphor was a memory, someone he'd lost, or someone he'd never let himself keep. As the 60s shifted into chaos and Dylan's fame reached fever pitch, the solitude inside him deepened. He had written about every kind of love except the one that might last. Yet even then, the universe seemed to be guiding him toward the woman who would finally challenge the distance he'd spent a lifetime protecting. She would not be drawn to the poet or the prophet, but to the man hidden beneath the disguise. Her name was Sara Lownds, and when she arrived, everything he thought he understood about love, and about himself, began to unravel. When Bob Dylan met Sara Lownds in the mid-60s, his world was already spinning. He was 24, living at the center of cultural upheaval, and exhausted from carrying the label of voice of a generation. She was quiet, graceful, and uninterested in fame. A former model and single mother, Sara carried an air of mystery that drew him in. She didn't ask about his lyrics. She didn't try to interpret him. For the first time, Dylan felt seen without being studied. They met through mutual friends in New York. To those who watched them together, it seemed almost improbable, two people moving in opposite directions finding calm in each other's orbit. She offered stillness. He offered escape. When they married in 1965, the ceremony was private, almost secret. No reporters, no press releases, no spectacle. Dylan had finally found something too sacred to share. In their home in Woodstock, he experienced the one thing fame had denied him: anonymity. The couple built a life surrounded by nature, music, and children. For a few brief years, Dylan stopped running. The man who had once needed movement now found peace in routine: breakfasts, family walks, and quiet nights. Out of that stillness came one of his greatest works, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, a sprawling love song written for Sara while she slept. She became his muse, not because she inspired his art, but because she grounded it. The cryptic wanderer began to sound human again. Songs like I Want You and Just Like a Woman carried warmth, longing, and gratitude. Even his voice softened. Friends noticed a new ease in him, less guarded, more open. It was as if Dylan had discovered that love didn't need to be mythologized. It could simply be lived. But fame has a way of finding even those who hide from it. The media followed them, hungry for details. Fans treated their home like a pilgrimage site. Dylan's desire for privacy clashed with a public that refused to let him vanish. The pressure returned, and the walls began to close in. Yet despite it all, Sara remained his refuge. For nearly a decade, she was the center of his world. Their marriage gave him the balance he had been chasing since his youth, a balance between freedom and belonging, between silence and song. Still, even the purest love can't survive the weight of a legend. The same solitude that once drew him to her would soon start pulling him away. By the mid-70s, the quiet life Bob Dylan built with Sara Lownds began to crumble. What started as refuge turned into tension, the kind that lingers between two people who still love each other but can no longer find common ground. Fame had returned, uninvited and relentless. Reporters circled their home, dissecting his every move. Dylan tried to protect what they had, but the world he'd escaped was waiting for him to come back. He began touring again, restless and distracted. The songs that once celebrated love became layered with ache. During recording sessions, musicians noticed a distance in his eyes, as if he were replaying a story only he could hear. Friends later said he looked haunted, by guilt, by regret, by the fear that he was repeating the same patterns that had once kept him alone. Out of that pain came Blood on the Tracks. To this day, it remains one of the most intimate records in music history. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. Dylan called it fiction, but those who listened closely recognized the truth woven into every verse. If you see her, say hello. You're gonna make me lonesome when you go, and Shelter from the Storm sounded less like songs and more like pages torn from a diary. It was heartbreak set to melody, an album of apology without a name. Sara heard it too. The distance between them had become impossible to ignore. They were living separate lives under the same roof, speaking through silence. Dylan's need for isolation clashed with her longing for normalcy. Love hadn't vanished. It had just exhausted itself. The man who once wrote her love songs now hid behind metaphors again, retreating into the only place he felt safe, his art. Their divorce in 1977 was quiet, almost dignified. There were no public arguments, no scandal, only an ache that lingered in the spaces where they had once found peace. Dylan rarely spoke of it afterward. When asked about Blood on the Tracks, he shrugged, insisting it was about no one in particular, but those who knew him said otherwise. He would never again write about love with that kind of honesty. The album marked both an ending and a confession. Whatever else he achieved, the awards, the Nobel Prize, the endless acclaim, nothing would carry the same raw emotion as the songs he wrote for Sara. In losing her, Dylan rediscovered the loneliness that had always followed him. Yet deep inside, he understood something he never could before, that love wasn't meant to be solved or owned. It was meant to change him, and it had. After the divorce, Bob Dylan stepped back from the world. The man who had once filled arenas seemed to shrink from public life, choosing solitude over spotlight. For years he avoided questions about his marriage, deflecting them with a smirk or silence. To some it looked like detachment. To those who understood him, it was survival. Every song he'd ever written was a confession in disguise, and now he had nothing left to hide behind. The loneliness returned, but this time it was quieter. Dylan spent long stretches on the road, not chasing applause but trying to outwalk his memories. He filled notebooks that no one would read, writing about loss, faith, and redemption. The music that followed carried a different tone, older, more reflective, less certain. His voice, now rougher and worn, seemed to carry the weight of every goodbye he never said. Sara's name was rarely spoken, yet her presence lingered, in small details, in lyrics tucked deep within albums. Traces of her kept resurfacing. Listeners could hear her shadow in Tangled Up in Blue, in Simple Twist of Fate, even decades later in Sara, a song he performed sparingly, as if it cost him something each time. He explored religion, philosophy, and purpose, perhaps hoping that belief could fill the space love once had. The gospel albums of the late 70s and early 80s showed a man searching for absolution. Behind the devotion was grief, a longing not for faith itself, but for peace. He had built his life on reinvention, yet there was one identity he could never escape, the man who had loved and lost Sara Lownds. When he finally began writing his memoir Chronicles, Volume 1, fans expected confessions. Instead, they found fragments, memories half told, moments reframed, names withheld. It was Dylan's way of staying in control. Still, those fragments carried emotion too specific to be invention. A look exchanged, a line recalled, a fleeting reference to a love that made him both fearless and fragile. In rare interviews, when her name came up, he'd pause before answering. Sometimes he'd smile faintly and change the subject. Other times, his silence said everything. Regret had softened into acceptance. The bitterness had turned into gratitude. He no longer sang to win her back. He sang because she had existed, and that was enough. Through it all, Dylan's songs remained his language of remembrance. He never wrote a memoir about her, never offered a full explanation. Instead, he let his music carry what words could not, a lifelong echo of the love that shaped his soul. Today, Bob Dylan no longer hides behind riddles. At 84, his presence on stage feels stripped of everything but truth. The crowd still waits for answers he's never given, but what he offers now is something deeper, glimpses of peace. His voice has grown rough, his phrasing slower, yet every word carries the gravity of a man who has lived through everything love can give and take away. When he revisits the songs from his past, there's a stillness in him, as if he's performing them for someone who isn't there. He doesn't need to explain who she was anymore. The emotion is enough. Fans describe watching him sing Sara as witnessing something sacred, an artist revisiting a memory, not for nostalgia, but for closure. In recent writings, Dylan reflects on love as both a burden and a miracle. He admits that time changes everything except the way certain faces stay in the mind. He never says her name outright, but the meaning is clear. The woman who once stood in his kitchen, the muse who inspired his greatest music, remains the quiet center of his story, not because he chose her as his subject, but because her presence reshaped him. He no longer chases absolution. The mystery that once defined him has softened into reflection. In interviews, when pressed about the past, he shrugs and says things like, "All you can do is keep moving." Yet within that humility lies recognition that even for a man who wrote the soundtrack of a century, some truths are too personal to perform. Those close to him say he lives simply now, surrounded by art, books, and the silence he once feared. Sometimes, after shows, he lingers at the piano long after the lights dim, playing to an audience only he can see. The lyrics may have changed over time, but the emotion has not. Beneath the layers of myth and history, the one constant remains: the love that shaped the man behind the legend. He will never issue a grand declaration or memoir of confession. Bob Dylan doesn't reveal, he suggests. But at 84, the suggestion has become unmistakable. His songs were never just stories. They were letters to one woman, sent across decades, written in rhythm instead of ink. And in the quiet between verses, the truth still lingers. For all his genius, his poetry, his mystery, his greatest creation was love itself. In the end, Bob Dylan's story was never about fame, rebellion, or even music. It was about what happens when a man spends his life trying to turn emotion into art and realizes the truest masterpiece was never meant to be performed. Through every reinvention, every silence, and every song that blurred fact with feeling, one truth endured: the love that shaped him outlasted everything else. Sara Lownds remains the quiet thread through his greatest work, the muse he never needed to name because the music already did. Their time together was brief compared to the legend that followed, yet it gave Dylan something no award or headline could: humanity. The poet found his subject, the wanderer found home. And even after losing her, he carried that discovery in every word that came after. At 84, when Dylan steps onto a dimly lit stage, the applause fades and the voice that once divided generations falls to a whisper. There are no explanations left to give, no mysteries left to protect, only the songs and the love that never stopped echoing through them. For more emotional stories, check out this video.